Greg Henselman. He did his undergraduate degree at Willamette University and in Oregon, and his master's degree at University of Oregon, both in mathematics, before coming to Penn, where he's been a PhD student working with Rob Greist for the past several years. So today he's going to talk about his recent work in topology. So, Greg, we're very excited.
Thank you. I'm excited too. I also decided not to tell you about my recent work. I'm going to tell you about my recent work at the very end, but since this is maybe my last chance to talk to the ESE students as a group, I thought the time might be better spent if I told you a little bit more about my field, because it's often seen as kind of obscure, and why it might be interesting to you and who you might talk to if you ever had a question relating to topological data analysis once I am no longer around. So I'm going to jump right into it. The theme throughout is just going to be how could topological data analysis possibly be useful for you and for your research. Great, thank you. Thanks. All right, I don't need this. Okay, how can topological data analysis possibly be relevant to the work that you're doing? All right, I'm going to start out a little bit slow, just with some basic definitions. So the basic building block for most of the things that people do in topological data analysis is a simplicial complex. All a simplicial complex is a generalization of a combinatorial graph. A combinatorial graph is a finite ground set of vertices and a collection of subsets of size 2. A simplicial complex is a ground set, finite ground set of vertices for our purposes, and a collection of subsets, some of which might have cardinality more than 2. And the only rule is if you have a subset of size 4, 5, 6, 7, or however many, every subset contained in it also has to be in your family of subsets. So if I have 1, 2, 3, I have to have 2, 3, I have to have 1, 2, and I have to have 1, 3. So if you like, a simplicial complex is a special case of a hypergraph with this added assumption that you're closed undertaking subsets, which turns out to be a fairly mild assumption for many modeling purposes. You still get a lot of descriptive power, and in return, you get a lot of mathematical power.
Sorry, what do you mean by ground set?
Just a finite set.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I'll mention, if anybody here works with, combinatorial graphs, networks, you can always go from a graph to a simplicial complex by the simple process of saying anytime you have a clique in the graph, a full subgraph, you can just say, okay, all the vertices in that clique together form a simplex. Right? And you can go, back in the other direction. Just forget about the simplices and you're back to a network. Right. So we all know how useful it is to think about the node adjacency matrix for a graph. This is the basis for a lot of the algebra that we do as engineers relating to network theory. And there is an analogous matrix you can associate to any simplicial complex. Here, the entries in these matrices we think of as elements in the two-element field, so binary 0, 1. And the only rule for constructing these things, just like in the case of a graph, you have this edge, and on on the boundaries of the edge are two things, one dimension lower. One dimension lower than 1 is 0. You have two vertices on either side. For a triangle, that's a two-dimensional object. The boundaries are one dimension down. That's a one-dimensional line. And the rule is just take a triangle, look at all the lines that are on its boundary, and put a 1 there. Put a 0 everywhere else. Is that okay? Okay. So one thing that you notice off the bat is that the boundary of every triangle is a circuit of a graph. And this is, it's extremely simple, but it's the basis for a huge amount of mathematics. Part of the reason mathematicians were so interested in this structure to begin with is that it naturally relates a two-dimensional thing with a one-dimensional thing. And already in engineering, we know that things that relate a two-dimensional thing with its boundary are very useful. Stokes' theorem. Integral across a surface you can get as integral across a boundary. Fundamental theorem of calculus. An integral over an interval you can get as just the sum of two things on either endpoint of a line. Okay. So this is just to point that out. And I'll say just a word on, oftentimes topologists like to think about problems in a spatial way because we're very visual people. And the way that we do that for a simplicial complex, as I've been showing you, I'm just going to make it formal. If you have a combinatorial simplicial complex, it's just a combination of subsets. But if you put those points in Euclidean space, and they have kind of a generic distribution so that you don't accidentally put, say, 3 points on the same line, that kind of crushes a triangle down in a way that you don't want to do it. So if you put your points in kind of a generic position in a high enough dimensional Euclidean space, you can always make these things realizable. And in general, it doesn't matter what dimension you embed things in, so this is just the basis for the pictures that I draw. If you have any questions about what a picture means, I'm happy to answer that question. Okay, so I'm interested in understanding these simplicial complexes, and I'm interested in doing it from the perspective of a data analyst. So I want something about this thing that a computer can easily understand and describe. Okay, so this is just a graph, and we already know all sorts of things that can tell you about graphs. In order to go in the direction of learning what you can learn from a simplicial complex with the computer, I just want to point out, if this graph is embedded in the plane, then it cuts off 4 bounded subsections of the plane, right? 4 connected components if I remove the points associated with this graph from the plane, and one giant connected component outside. Right? It's the same no matter how I embed this graph in the plane. And we can see that pretty clearly visually. And in fact, if you want a computer to calculate the number of connected components, you can just take a spanning tree, start adding edges in one at a time from outside the spanning tree. Each one of those edges is going to disconnect another component of the plane. Right? So if you want to count components, that's an easy thing to do. Right? And you can do this without having an embedding. You don't have to know how the graph sits in the plane to do it. All you need is the combinatorial information about how the graph is put together. Right? This is just to formalize that statement. Okay. So like I said, you don't have to have an embedding. And in fact, for our eyes, you really don't need an embedding period to have an intuitive idea of sort of how many loops there are in the graph. In every one of those pictures of the graph with 4 connected components, you could kind of see that there were 4 loops. In this picture, you don't have to see an embedding to know that there are kind of essentially, I don't know how many there are in this picture, but there are a bunch of loops. The number that you could associate. And that number is just, the number of edges in a spanning tree, or the number of edges not in a spanning tree, because each edge not in a spanning tree adds a loop, just like in that construction where we took, spanning tree, each loop, or each additional edge adds a loop. Okay. And this is just that formula. Okay. So that's a shape descriptor for graphs. Now, how do we kip up to simplices? Well, suppose I had this simplicial complex and I had it embedded in the plane. Right? How many connected components are there now? There are only 3. And that's because I took out this gray triangle along with the graph. Right? Combinatorially, if I didn't know how this thing were embedded in the plane, how would I count the number of connected components when I take this thing out of it? Well, you can see from this picture, you just take the number of loops and you subtract off 1 for the triangle. So that's naive. There's a formula for it. And this, this works fine anytime you have a graph embedded in the plane. As before, you don't really need an embedding to know that if you stick this thing in the plane somehow, count the number of connected components you get, because we did everything combinatorially. And that's kind of nice, because what if you encounter something like this and it's in 3 dimensions? There's a perfectly good shape descriptor you can associate with this. It's combinatorial. You don't need to know how to embeds. And it's simple to calculate, and it has a geometric meaning.
Can you say again, what's the definition of the connected component in this case?
So in this case, when I talk about connected components, I'm only talking about in the case where the graph embeds into the plane. So if this embeds into the plane, and I take out this simplicial complex, then I've got a component here, component here, component here, and then a big component outside. Okay, so this is sort of nice in the same way that graphs are nice, because we can analyze them combinatorially or algebraically without knowing how they sit in space. In general, if you had any kind of data analysis system that depended on embedding a graph correctly in a plane, then you would be in hot water. Okay. So suppose you encountered this simplicial complex. I'm just going here because I need to at least pay lip service to the algebra that goes into doing this kind of analysis, even though we won't draw on it. So let me just make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what we're looking at. I've essentially taken a pyramid, turned it upside down, taken off the base. So I have kind of a cup with 3 triangular sides, and then 2 edges of a graph coming up. Okay? All right. So we can apply our formula to this thing, right? So we can count the number of loops in the graph. That means find a tree. That's the blue edges. Find the number of edges not in the tree. That gives you the total number of loops in the graph. In this case, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then subtract off the number of triangles, 1, 2, 3. And you're left with just this one triangle. You're left with the number of 1. And that corresponds to the idea that in this shape, there's kind of essentially one loop. There may be some other loops, but they go around triangles. And we think about things that go around triangles as things that you can kind of squish through the triangle to nothing. Right? There's one essential loop in this space. This turns out to be an extremely powerful idea, as I'll get to in a moment. And now the mandatory lip service. What happens if I add an extra triangle to the top? So I have my cup with the 3 triangles on the sides. If I add another triangle to the top, well, intuitively, when I add this triangle to the top, this loop doesn't stop being a loop. It's not like I can crush that loop through a triangle anymore. But all of a sudden, my formula goes from telling me there's 1 loop to 0 loops. All right? So this looks like a problem until you realize that the thing that you really need to do to correct this is just take that matrix that we talked about. We had the node adjacency matrix for the graph and then one for the triangles. Just instead of taking the number of triangles, take the rank of that matrix. You want to subtract the rank of that matrix, and you'll get to the right number. Okay, that's all the painful work we have to do for the day. So we made it. Okay. So I claimed that this idea was powerful, and why is it powerful? Well, in part because when I showed you this picture and I said, if you put the lid on top of the cup that doesn't change the loop, we have a very intuitive visual idea that this loop remained. We can reason about that with some kind of visual or spatial processing part of our brain without doing any of these calculations. And similarly, so it tells you that this mathematics it aligns somehow with some kind of actually surprisingly complex piece of processing that our brains do. For example, if we look at this picture, you can see a big circle essentially embedded in the data. It's theoretically possible that a computer might be able to pick up that this is a circle somehow. You would probably have to make kind of specialized software to do it. It's not just It's not something that a computer naturally sees, like maybe a separating hyperplane or something that has a simple model. But you can do the following thing. Take the proximity network of these points, which means take any two points that are within some cutoff epsilon. You have to choose the epsilon, but there are ways around that. There are ways to choose good epsilons. Connect any 2 points that are that close. And remember I said there was this construction. Anytime you see a triangle, just fill it in with a simplex. So do that for your network, and you get something that looks like this. And our eyes now tell us, looking at this thing, that there should be essentially one loop. And in fact, that's exactly what there is. And there are some useful, sort of powerful topological theorems that say if you do this construction under mild hypotheses, your calculation will always return the number 1. Mm-hmm. And this calculation is pretty robust. So there's still a circle here. We've subjected the data to some kind of bias. We can do the same construction, and we still get the number 1. We can choose sort of a massively different epsilon, even much bigger than this, and we still get the number 1. So this quantity is somehow something that isn't really sensitive to choices that we make, and it reflects something complex and geometrically meaningful about the underlying data. Mm. So how could this possibly be relevant to an engineer? It's nice mathematics, and maybe it's nice for modeling for scientists. Here's one very simple example. Suppose, I'm going to set up a model. Suppose that you have some domain, some configuration space, say 2-dimensional, where a robot or just something can move around, right? And maybe this is a room, maybe it's a field, maybe it's a city block or whatever. You have some kind of agent who moves around this space, and there are some landmarks here marked by little gray nodes. And the only thing that this agent can do is naively walk around, doesn't have GPS, doesn't have doesn't have the memory capacity to store a lot of scanning data about the space that it's in, doesn't have a lot of energy to do very complicated calculations. So all it does is record the ID numbers for these landmarks. And it records specifically what landmarks it can see at the same time. So for example, let's see. The blue landmark and the orange landmark. If there's a robot standing here, he might be able to see these two guys at the same time. So he just records that these two are co-visible. So you get this graph, just a co-visibility network. If you take the clique complex, this construction that I talked about, filling in the triangles for this network, you get something with 2 holes in it, which reflects the fact that there are essentially 2 holes in this environment, at least according to our visual intuition. This is very, very low-grade relational data. There are no numbers involved. It's just a combinatorial thing that's still fairly robust. You can imagine that you could perturb some of these shapes a little bit, and the fundamental structure of what's going on isn't going to change. And in fact, there are strong theorems that say, as long as this is vaguely in this configuration and there are enough landmarks, you'll always recover the number of holes in your space from this simple calculation. So if, for example, you just dropped one of these robots in a city block, and you didn't give it GPS, you didn't give it the ability to read anything except for the unique IDs of a few landmarks, but you didn't tell it where those landmarks are. It just was able to, say, okay, this is a landmark, and if I come back to it, I'll recognize it. Right? It doesn't say it's the stop sign here. It just says, I'll recognize this if I come back to it. Well, you can set up a Kalman filter. The Kalman filter is based on the number of holes your robot would expect to see if it were in a given place. Right? So just let the robot scurry around this environment, counting the number of holes in its immediate vicinity. And as long as the robot, without GPS, but some a priori just idea of how things are laid out, can rapidly start to localize Let me see, do I have a good visual? Yeah, so over time, you can actually become fairly certain about where he is in his environment using nothing but extremely low-grade relational data. This was done a few years ago.
So is this a Kalman filter or particle?
I think they did this with the Kalman filter.
So Kalman filter generally requires some kind of continuous representation. Here you have all discrete form, right? Just thinking about how it can be superposed into Kalman also.
Right. I would have to go back and review. I understood this well a few years ago. But I can look into it. I can also send the references. So here's another example. Again, the theme is that the simple idea of the number of loops in a space can give you a very robust measurement of some kind of complex phenomenon. Right? So here's another one, another simple one from the way that our brains actually function to think about space. Right? So before I bring in the brains, I'm just going to tell you what the construction is. So as before, I have some kind of environment. In this case, it's a 2D environment that an animal can move around in. And I'm just going to say, this is my model. I have some subsets of the environment that I'm going to mark with blue or green or yellow rectangles. There's no significance to the color. I just want it to be visually clear what different things are. Right? So as before, once I have these regions that cover the space, I can make a simplicial complex by connecting two nodes if their colored regions overlap. Is that okay? Right. And as before, you can see that the number of loops matches the number of loops. Right. Well, it turns out that there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus that's important for spatial navigation, spatial location. And the cells in the hippocampus, this part of the hippocampus, have this very particular behavior. Each cell has a physical region such that when the animal is in that region, that particular neuron turns on. So if I'm here, my neuron for this spot turns on. If I'm over here, my neuron for this spot turns on. And scientists can measure this. This was done a long time ago, back in the 60s, 70s. The guy who ran that experiment just won a Nobel Prize for that research. And so this is an important part of how this part of the brain functions. It's also how several other parts of the brain function. And it interacts with this construction in a very simple, natural way. So if you suppose that I have some animal that's in the environment, so it's in this blue region, so that means the neuron for that region is going to turn on. If the animal moves to some intersection, well, it's in both of these two regions, so both of these are going to turn on. As the animal moves throughout, more and more regions are going to co-fire. And the co-firing regions exactly trace out this simplicial complex. Right? So this is a very natural mechanism by which an animal's brain, in a very complex way, maps out sort of a simplicial complex. And we know, there's work is ongoing, but we know that co-firing between sets of neurons can be a trigger for forming stronger connections. So people who knew a little bit of topology and knew this fact about the hippocampus said, wow, we think maybe this is an important part of actually the way our brain codes spatial information. And there have been a number of studies on this. For example, most of this was done in the last few years. I'll just call out a couple. This is the very first one where they ran a simulation just to see, based on the way that they know neurons fire and based on, how this complex is formed, could an animal actually realistically recover the right number of loops for a specific kind of local area of its environment? And the answer is yes, under some pretty mild assumptions. Of course, there were people who said, that's a fine theory, But there's no reason not to think that these cells are just reacting to the fact that the animal already knows where it is in its environment. Maybe my cell for right here fires because some other part of my brain just knows that I'm here, and this is just a simple consequence. This is one nice example of where topological reasoning actually gave predictive power in a scientific situation. Some people said, okay, well, we can test this. And the way that they tested it was by creating a maze, or just a long tube that a rat can move around, and the tube is clear, so that at all times the rat can see where it is on a 3D grid. But it's also jointed, and they can move the joints. Right? So each one of these colored sections corresponds to a piece that they can move. And so the hypothesis is, if this topological mechanism is really underlying something about the way the animal encodes where it is in space, and these cells are really, they're not tied to, they're not reacting to some overarching idea of where the rat is in 3D space in the world. It's just reacting to local information about what the rat sees. Then you would expect the hippocampus to behave the same if it's, say, in this blue section, no matter whether this blue section is here in global coordinates or if it's scrunched back here. Is that okay?
I guess my question would be, what's the mechanism by which it would be able to gain this local information in the first place? Visual or,
That is a complex question. Yeah. And I think that has not been addressed. It's a well-documented phenomenon that the cells behave that way. But part of the reason for this study is understanding why it does. And so the punchline is that, of course, I probably wouldn't be telling you this story if it didn't go my way. The rat really seems to react to this local information about what section of the maze it's in, not global 3D coordinates. Right? And this is satisfying for a few reasons. For one thing, it's a very simple mechanism, Occam's razor. And for another, it makes sense that an animal would choose pieces of information to encode that are highly robust about its environment. Things like geometry, angles, distances are difficult to judge accurately. They're difficult to measure, and a lot of the time, they're subject to change. Things like the number of loops in an object, provided the loops are big enough, that's something fairly robust. And so it's satisfying that the brain would choose something that is a physically meaningful phenomenon. Yeah. Right. You're absolutely right. The choice of these regions, it determines everything. And there are lots and lots of ways, as you point out, to make this break down and fail. I wasn't sure that, well, I'm fairly sure that there isn't time in this particular talk to go into some of the mathematical reasons why these models can incorporate, that dependence. But what we generally find is that there's sort of a souped-up version of these invariants that is fairly robust to different choices. In particular, what mathematicians often do, and what seems very common in the natural world, is you don't look at this construction for a fixed epsilon, fix an epsilon and connect the graph. You look at it across a variety of different choices of epsilon. And there are simple mathematical mechanisms by which you can compare what you get at these different choices. And so if you get, for example, some kind of very strong signal that's consistent across different choices, then you can rely on that. So that gets into something called persistent homology. Persistent just means a signal persists across different choices, and it's big business. Okay, so speaking of business, if I haven't persuaded you yet that this isn't just a mathematical curiosity, there is a company in Palo Alto that is making money right now, hand over fist, by doing nothing but this type of analysis. In fact, they do analysis that's even simpler in many ways. They handle data sets like this. So this is from a study that's from a while back on diabetes. They measured just a lot of different biostatistics for a variety of people who had different types of diabetes. They measured something like, I can't remember how many, it was a lot of numbers. So each one of these patients gave you a point in, I don't know, 17, 100, 200 dimensional space. And you had a point cloud, and they wanted to understand it. And this was before the days when we had really great computers for doing fancy clustering techniques. But they were fortunate enough to find a projection down into three-dimensional space that seemed to reflect something about the data. Specifically, these two flares correspond to different types of diabetes. And these points, I mean, there's some natural structure to these points that you would expect to be meaningful no matter whether this is embedded in R3 or R10 or R100. These points just seem to group together in a continuum, and these ones as well with this stuff in the center. And as it turns out, some of these topological techniques, because they're multi-dimensional in nature, allow you to capture not just the fact that points are close by and do a simple clustering, they tell you how those clusters fit together in sort of an unusual way. So, people were really lucky to find this projection that reflected something meaningful about the space. If you just put that point cloud in one of these black box topological clustering machines, you can get something like this automatically, knowing nothing about the data a priori, and then you can investigate what these flares mean. One of the early applications of this was in genomics. They looked at biopsies from breast cancer. This was, I don't know, 5 years ago, something like that. So they got this space, and the scientists could account for essentially everything except for this little blip on the end. And when they investigated it, it turned out that was a genetic marker that a very specific subset of the population had, and everybody in that subset survived. So now they have medical information that essentially, if you have this genetic marker, you probably don't need chemo. This is one of the first applications of this type of analysis to kind of complex heterogeneous data. Right? And if this doesn't convince you that it's useful, yeah. Some of that is proprietary now. But the basic idea is that you can set up an eccentricity function. So if you take has anybody here heard of Reeve graphs? So you can, if you have an object, there's a naive way to set up an eccentricity function. It's just a function that assigns to each point, say on my body, some measure of how far you are from the center. So the core might have distance 0. My fingers and toes might have the biggest distance. And you can do a construction essentially where you make a simplicial complex that's built out of just the farthest points. So at first I just get the tips of my fingers and my toes. And then you grow that simplicial complex a little by adding in the points that are closer in, so you get the hands. And then as you come in farther and farther, you build out more. So you get a tree automatically, but you can use some topological tricks to get information that's slightly more complicated than a tree, like these little loops in the graph. And in fact, part of the reason TDA has been useful in this, and now some other genetic studies, phylogenetic trees were big business for a long time, but people started realizing that the things that you want to study aren't always trees, and when they're not trees, they're really hard to get a handle on. And this mathematics of loops actually is starting to give people some traction where they didn't think they had any traction before. And as I said, if this didn't convince you that this could be useful for something, they're actually using it to investigate insurance claims, along with a lot of other things. Surprisingly, this is getting a lot of traction in organizational science because it deals with heterogeneous complex data so well. And again, IOSG is getting a lot of face time from me today. But these are just some of the clients. They work with a lot of major government agencies and some pretty big corporations. So somebody thinks it's useful. If you don't happen to work with point cloud data, if you don't happen to be working in genetics, genomics, if you don't happen to be working in robotics, is there still any imaginable relevance of TDA for you? And the answer is yes. So I've kind of been going from more complex to, or more specific to less specific material as I go on through this talk. Here's about as unspecific as you can get. Suppose you just have a matrix. Say it's a correlation matrix between some kind of something that you're measuring. Say it's something somebody just hands you, and you want to know, is this matrix random? Are the numbers in each place in this matrix coming from some kind of IID distribution of some kind? There are some old ways that you could theoretically try to tackle this question. So Wigner's semicircular law says that if you fix one IID distribution, Gaussian, binomial, whatever, and you use that to generate the entries of a matrix, and then you let the size of the matrix go to infinity, then at some point, the eigenvalues of that matrix will start to lie on a semicircle. Right? The rate of convergence is a complicated thing. It's not something that you can easily figure out for any given distribution, let alone a distribution that you don't know a priori. And it's very sensitive to bias. So if you took the entries of your IID matrix, you subjected it to just a nonlinear, monotone increasing deformation, you can very rapidly change the eigenvalue statistics. Right? And there are a lot of situations in life where you can't be, you can't be so sure that you're not looking at something through a nonlinear lens. But there is a completely naive, completely simple calculation that anybody can do that's a surprisingly effective test. It doesn't depend on the distribution. The convergence rate is always the same. The convergence rate is fast. Once you have about 100 entries in your matrix, you have central limit theorems that tell you, that can allow you to reject a null hypothesis. And all you do is the following construction. You have this matrix that has numbers as the entries. Take for each column, or assume the matrix is square. Take for each column a vertex, and look at a sequence of simplicial complexes. And the way you build them is you start out with just a collection of points. The first thing you do is add the line corresponding to the lowest entry in your matrix. Right? Then find the next lowest entry in your matrix and add that line in. We're treating this kind of like a weighted adjacency matrix. Okay? Go through that process until you've added all the lines in. Do the structure. And then just make a simple graph. And in the first place, put the number of loops when you just have one edge. In the second place, put the number of loops when you have two edges. In the third place, the number of loops when you have three edges. And you get a graph like this. So the yellow here corresponds to the number of loops. The red and the blue correspond to higher dimensional analogs of loops that you can do using similar algebra to the algebra of counting loops with edges and triangles. And this topological central limit theorem says that if this matrix is truly random, then your curves, these functions that you get are going to look like this, with a central limit theorem, with confidence, yada, yada, yada. So now, if you have nothing else but a similarity matrix, whether it be correlations, measurements, anything, you can plug it into this black box, and if it looks truly random, it will look like this. And if it doesn't look random, there are other things that have very distinctive signatures. For example, geometric distributions of data. So this is one signature. If you didn't know, if this guy hadn't done this study back in the 1960s that said this is how neurons work in the brain, if you just looked at the co-firing rate of neurons in the brain, that's highly non-random. You know, two things are correlated. And it's non-random in a geometric way, as we already discussed, because when the rat is in a given location, it turns on two nearby things. And it turns out that geometrically arranged data has a very distinctive signature in this construction. And you can see it right here. So now you can look at any data at all. You can look at any other part of the brain. And you don't need to do some kind of complicated experiment where you keep track of where the animal is and see how it moves and how the neurons respond. You can just look at how neurons co-fire and get a pretty strong indicator for geometric structure. There are other signatures as well. So this is a naive thing that you can apply in a lot of situations. Okay. Maybe I'll just briefly mention that there are things that you can do with clustering. These are actual two-dimensional analogs of loops, which are spheres, that sit naturally in the brain that I'm studying with a guy named Chad Giusti, who's associated with Danny Bassett right now. And I'll just say a few words on these higher dimensional analogs of loops. So I mentioned, we have this pipeline that takes us from a point cloud to a number of loops. There's an analogous pipeline that takes us from a point cloud to sort of the number of two-dimensional enclosures. So you could imagine if you had some material in space and you had some point samples from that material, if it were porous, you could measure the number of cavities in it. Right? If that point cloud were in a much higher dimensional space, of course, you wouldn't necessarily be able to interpret these things as cavities. But just as you can always interpret the idea of the number of loops in a graph, no matter whether the graph is embedded in 2D, 3D, or whatever, there's a natural geometric meaning to these number of two-dimensional enclosures. And they can give you physically meaningful information because it's robust, just like the loops are robust. Yeah? Right. Well, that's an area of active research. I can tell you that a large part of the research that I do addresses that specific issue. One of the common ways, going back to this idea of looking at multiple different epsilon values, if you have a sufficiently fine point cloud and you fill in just the small edges, the short edges, then you get kind of a fine representation of this thing. And if it's fine enough, even if you have some points in the middle, maybe you don't have enough points to fill things in with triangles. So even if you have a sphere and there's some string inside the sphere that's connecting it to other things, you can still get the fact that there's a sphere there. And it's noisy. It's genuinely noisy. And I think my next example will indicate just how noisy this can be. Often what one uses is not the presence of a single thing. I mean, that's useful and that is used. But statistically, an average number of things. So specifically, here's kind of a tough problem from chemistry, understanding the compressibility of proteins. This is something that's fairly difficult to do even with simulations. And it's relevant to a lot of the work that people do. It's just really hard to get. Part of the reason that it's hard to get is that to measure compressibility, you kind of have to freeze the proteins, and then you have to exert pressure on them, and you have to be watching them with a microscope while you're doing all of these things. And so it's difficult and expensive. And it turns out topology can help you get around that problem. And the intuition for how to get around it is it's understood that the length of a protein tube correlates with the compressibility of that protein. For a number of different reasons. And people, it's hard to get a measurement of length but it's surprisingly doable to get an estimate of where the nucleus of a bunch of different atoms that make up the protein lies. You can actually get a point cloud. So this is a two-dimensional cross-section. The protein is a long kind of a tube with capped-off sides. And part of your geometric intuition looking at one of these tubes might be, okay, here's a single protein, and it has a bunch of different cavities in it. The single protein is likely to be bunched and knotted up together, so you're not likely to see a whole lot of loops in it, but you will expect to see a lot of two-dimensional cavities. There's going to be a specific ratio that you expect. Right? If your protein tubes are very short, you might get a whole bunch of protein tubes next to each other, and it starts to get easier to have one-dimensional cycles, so you would expect a different ratio. And some work done recently, in part by some folks at Penn, showed that using really, really low-grade information about where the nuclei of these atoms are, you can get an estimate on the number of two-dimensional enclosures, and you can get an estimate on the number of loops. And by comparing that ratio, you can actually predict protein compressibility with surprisingly high reliability. And considering the cost of actually figuring these things out, this is a saver in an important way. So this is meant as one example of a way that looking at higher dimensional invariance can help you. And the last example I want to show you, I just couldn't help. If anybody knows anything about smectics, nematic liquid crystals, you might know they come in many varieties, shapes, and sizes. But sort of important ones that people discovered early on were these rods. And these rods tend to align with each other depending on their environment, et cetera, et cetera. If you shine light on one of these crystals, you often see these patterns. You have to polarize the light in two directions to see this. And the pattern of light and dark you see here kind of reflects the orientation of these rods in space. And one of the things that people recognized early on, in fact, one of the reasons that we knew a long time ago, time before maybe we should have, that these things were rod, was people looked at pictures like this and they noticed that these flares coming out from these singularities, these point defects in the crystal, always have an even number of light or dark stripes. Right? And that has to do with the fact that when you have rods, around these point defects, the rods are changing their orientations. Right? That's what it means for the colors to change quickly around the rods. So if these are my rods, and here's a singularity, the rods might be all oriented like this, all in the same direction, in which case you might not see one of these flares. If the rods twist their orientation as they go around, then you would expect to see one of these things. And by a simple counting argument, you can kind of see that just by virtue of the fact that these rods, they always want to be fairly parallel to their neighbors. They never want to do something like this. A cut is something that is, for various chemical reasons, resisted. The places where you see 4 flares are the places where there's a double twist, etc. Right? And this is modeled. And I wanted to, to close off with this example because, again, this has been used in the industry to study liquid crystals for a long time because this phenomenon, this number of twists, this is deformation invariant. I can change this any way I want, and the rods are still going to want to stay parallel. They're going to want to stay aligned. Right? So this isn't just a matter of measurement. It's actually a piece of why the world works the way it does, because things that are deformation invariant are robust. Okay. This is a slide I stole from somebody else. So I'll take the last minute or so. I promised I would tell you something about my research. So here's 1 minute about my research. The people who studied smectics got a lot of mileage out of studying crystals in terms of these point defects. So instead of looking at maybe an entire vector field of how these rods are aligned, it turns out you can understand a lot about the dynamics of the space and dynamics of a vector field just by concentrating on the singular points, right? And this is a common refrain in dynamics everywhere if you pay attention to the critical points, right? And so the thrust of the research that I've done together with Rob Greist is say, okay, well, if I have one of these discretizations, some space like this, the number of cells can get huge very, very, very fast because of combinatorial explosion. And our idea was to focus on critical points. So we put a discrete vector field on this thing. And as it turns out, if the vector field has the right properties, then the critical points actually contain all the data. So you can get orders of magnitude, multiple orders of magnitude reduction in the size of the input before you even start to process information about a space. Right? And to quantify just how much compression you get, these are pretty old numbers. 53 is way less than the number of gigs I would need to store a complete simplicial complex with almost 8 billion simplices on my computer. I get it because of this massive reduction in input size. Again, to compare things with the status quo, this is the biggest published benchmark on record. There are no bigger calculations. These were just the first 250. The benchmark that I'm pointing to has only been calculated with supercomputers, except for my laptop, which was clearly able to go to bigger spaces. So here's a specific calculation. If I take the point cloud generated by 2,000 points from the Stanford Dragon, so this is the existing software. The most memory efficient, not distributed implementation used 64 gigs to get this Dragon, and I can do it it's now down to about 1 gig on my laptop. And to put this in historic context, so these dots correspond to the biggest published benchmark running from 2005 to 2017. A word on the points in this thing. Way back here is the stuff on liquid crystals. Physicists were using that a long time ago. There are a number of other applications people were using a long time ago. The reason we didn't see as much modeling done in this kind of discrete way using point clouds before was we didn't have the computing power. So 2005 was about the first time people realized that they could actually use computers to get some of these environments, count the number of loops, count the number of enclosures. This is the founding of that company, IOSD, that I showed you. It's making money hand over fist. Some of the first applications to image analysis, that's now being incorporated in some standard or some standard software packages. Genetics, genomics, this is about when that breast cancer study came out. Recently, they actually have the first Cancer Institute Center that's specifically designed for the exclusive purpose of studying cancer with topology. I don't see Wei-Yu here. In here, we have a bunch of people from Penn. We have Jeff Dupre, Avik Day, Dan Kodacek, Santiago Segarro, Wei-Yu He, lots of people here, students and faculty doing stuff. So again, these dots correspond to the biggest calculations people have managed. This was the Stanford Dragon, the biggest one as of a couple years ago. This low dot is the first benchmark we took with our computing procedure. And the higher one is where we are right now. So again, to put this in scale, this is the result of a multi-year collaboration between some major computing centers in Europe. And this is what they could do with the biggest machine that they could throw at. This is my computer with more than 80% of its memory devoted to other things, as well as a lot of its processing power. So the moral that I want to get to, again, the reason that I wanted to talk to you guys about all of this is that applied topology right now is a high-growth industry. So these are some schools where they have people who are actively working on this type of stuff. If I put the actual number of schools, it would be about 5 times that many. The first applied topology journal is going online, I think, this year. We have multiple more companies opening up other than that first one. And as I hope I have communicated through some of the examples, you don't need to know a lot of complicated math to understand where one of these black boxes might be useful to you. And there's a huge need right now for more engineers to look into this field. The mathematicians have done a lot of work, but they don't specialize in making software. They don't specialize in modeling the kinds of things that even scientists need to model. That really is work for us, and there's more work than people can do right now. There are more open fields, let alone problems, than there are researchers. And so, a moral is, if you think that something like this might be relevant to what you do, don't assume that it's too hard to talk about or think about. It might be really easy. And maybe talk with any one of these people. It's a small subset of the people who work in this area at Penn, and see if it's relevant to your work. I mean, applied topologists are looking for new problems, and as I said, it's a high growth field if you're ever short on things to do. So that's it.
point cloud of data, you run your topological, procedure, and you recognize that there's a shape. Okay, so now what? So how can I use that? Like, has this kind of question been asked within your community or not?
It's a question that has been asked. People have tried to answer it in very, very different ways. And people have gotten traction in very, very different ways. Although, in general, I think the consensus is, it's a really big question, and there are big parts that haven't been addressed. One of the early applications was their mapper algorithms. Everybody wants to be able to detect a Swiss roll and know that you should parameterize it around in a circle like this. One thing that my group is working on right now, there are some specific spaces that are important to understand, even in something like robotics. Things like periodic or quasi-periodic dynamical systems, where you have maybe multiple different values occurring periodically. So you have one value going around like this. You have another one going around like this. This fills out a torus. And there are some topological techniques actually for parameterizing that. So you can automatically detect periodicity. There are some clustering techniques. That's another thing that we're looking at. And I know that I've heard rumors that people are looking at topology and some kind of deep learning. I haven't heard a lot since then. I think maybe the closest thing would be this Kalman filters, where people are just using topological data to inform as just one of their statistics. It is, and so there are a number of different takes that people use. I know I sound like a broken record. I always go back to the same thing, looking at multiple different parameter values and looking at what stays robust across different choices. That's actually, one of the things this company likes to tout about itself is you can give it give a computer information you know nothing about, and it will pick out the features that should be significant for you. Whether the data lies on a line, whether it lies on a surface. Also, your question is something that people are actively working on, and it's a hotly contested field right now. I mean, people are using, they're getting results, but the mathematics of why the results are as good as they are is not established yet.
If you care about the topological features of the data as opposed to statistical features, then should you use a different recipe for feature selection and go to one feature?
That's a good question, and I guess the right answer is I don't know. I don't know.
What about for streaming points? Getting them to see
Yeah.
Does this hold up? Will your clusters and your colored points in your graph drastically change?
It depends on the type of data. There's a big group at Rutgers right now who's studying time series data, studying dynamics with these constructions. And there is some machinery in place. I don't know, were you focused more on like getting robust data or understanding something about the way something changes?
A sequential way to compute the things you're computing here. Get one more data point, revise mine.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to, it seems like all the stuff you presented, you have all the data, you have this batch of data, you apply your technique. So I was just wondering if there's any work in that you know of.
Yeah, I can tell you that one of the motivations that data scientists decided that this was a good idea in the first place was that if you do have, say, two subsamples of a bigger piece, all the machinery that I described kind of gives you a language for connecting invariance about this and invariance about this to this guy and comparing them. So this is the mathematics of functoriality. It's part of why algebraic topology actually became interesting to mathematicians in the first place, exactly because of this. I mean, this is a very relevant piece of the story. This is, if you're interested, zigzag homology.
What's the typical computational complexity of going from a point cloud to one of these?
So the computational complexity for going from just a simplicial complex to these numbers, loops, spheres, etc., it's matrix multiplication in the worst case. The size of the simplicial complex really depends on the particular data set. In the worst case, it's factorial growth. You get combinatorial explosion. That's part of the reason why we put together the work that we did, because that's sublinear. What people tend to see in practice is a lot like what people see with linear programming. It's rare that you see things that don't run in linear time. And if you set your calculations up right, it's highly sublinear, which is good because these spaces grow fast.